So for everybody joining us today, please welcome on today's webinar, Navigating Uncertainty, Dynamic Scenarios in Strategic Workforce Planning. Little bit of housekeeping, as I mentioned. What we'll do, because there's such a huge amount of great content, we'll please through the session use the Q&A and the chat box, but what we'll do is we'll actually allow some time at the end to go through any of those questions. For those that haven't met me before, my name's Jo Skipper. I'm the Managing Director of The Next Step. We're absolutely delighted to welcome back Chris and Alicia from Equate Consulting on this great topic. You know, as a business leader myself, I've certainly experienced the challenges of its uncertainty. I think for many of us who are jumping on this webinar, we all started 2021 with, you know, a huge amount of hope and potential for what the year was going to be after a pretty torrid 2020. However, as we sit here in August, with many more challenges ahead of us, both in the short term and the longer term, in how to navigate our business success. This webinar just coming at such a timely period. I'm absolutely delighted to have Chris Hare and Alicia Roach, who are absolute deep experts in this topic. Chris, now a temporary resident of Austin, Texas, where he's growing the footprint of Equate for his sins, cut his teeth in HR, reward and benefits during his tenure at NBN. I guess in that and where he met Alicia, and in that whole period, I guess, of NBN's mass scale up and scale down, really understood the critical business importance of strategic workforce planning. Alicia, similarly, significant career with ASX businesses, NBN and Qantas, before co-founding Equate in 2014. Now a highly in-demand speaker and thought leader on this topic. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you both rejoin The Next Step and the next group, and thank you so much for sharing your insights. We're absolutely delighted to have you.
Thank you so much. What a incredibly warm introduction. We are delighted to speak to folks today about a particular element of strategic workforce planning, which is dynamic scenarios. And as everyone knows, there's no single one possible future. There's many different possible futures. And in fact, right now, all of us across the various continents that we're on this call are experiencing those different futures. And, you know, we used to say about this a year ago, didn't we, Alicia, that, well, the last year was hard to predict, but now we're emerging and all this stuff, and here we are again. So trying to predict the future and think about these things has never been more critical. And we're going to talk today about how you work your way through those different possible futures and avoid short-term decisions. So if you bear with me, I will bring that up. So Alicia, do you want to start us off?
Okay, so first up, we've got a little poll just of our attendees, and hopefully you'll get the poll button arising shortly. But this is, if you could answer yes or no, if you know the workforce, so the size, the shape, the skills that your organization needs right now. And I think, you know, this is really important for us because depending on the industry, the workforce makes up to 92% of an organization's cost base and is the biggest asset. You know, it's the source of competitive advantage. It's the source of innovation that we're all looking for. It's the source of, you know, how we really deliver customer value. So that poll's just hopefully popped up for you. So if you can answer that now, that would be great.
Oh, I tried to answer, Alicia, and it won't let me. I can't cheat.
Yeah, we're not allowed to vote. We're not allowed.
Can't cheat.
So hopefully the answers are coming in. Yes, there's a few nuances there, but that's okay, Marcus. You can answer yes for that one. You've got some sort of view. That's a good starting point. All right.
Hey.
All right. So about half of you feel like you've got a good sense on what the organization needs right now. So that's great. Generally we find the average is around about 30%. And, so it's great that half of you feel like you've got a good sense. However, half of you still don't, which is a bit of a worry. Let's go to the next question. And now, if you can answer again for me, what about the same question, but in 3 or 5 years' time? So, for example, again, we're looking at, does your organization, Chris, if you can just jump to the next slide, know the workforce size, shape, skills that it's going to need in 3 or 5 years' time? Again, if we just pop up the little poll and you can answer yes or no again. All right. Let's see the poll results. Hopefully they'll come in shortly. No, yeah. And so this is typically what we find happens. Most organizations have a little bit of a view of where they're at today. I wouldn't say generally it's the majority, although in our poll it is today, which is great. But pretty much most organizations don't have that same view for 3 or 5 years' time. Yet every single organization that we speak to knows that it is going to change, that it will look different in 3 or 5 years' time. And so it's really, a bit of a worry for us as HR practitioners that we know that we're going to change, that our organization is going to change. Our organization is the workforce is the organization. So not having any kind of plan for that is a real worry. And so that's what we're really trying to achieve today. And what we're showing you is some sort of view for the future of what workforce we need in the future. And it's not about crystal balling, it's just about having a plan around what is our biggest cost, what is our biggest asset, and bringing a real discipline to that and the way we consider that.
That's right. We're talking about how do we accelerate achievement by connecting people to purpose. And that purpose has a significant impact. We're talking about your customer value proposition. How do you realize profit? How do you reach transformation milestones? How do you, in fact, even realize the level of sales that you're planning to do when you're serving customer? And even beyond that, one of our key customers is the United Nations, and they're worried about fulfilling their mandates. But if they don't have the right capability and capacity in the right places, they're not going to be able to help the people that they're intending to work with. In strategic workforce planning, our organization is really 3 things: a platform, a philosophy, and a process. Today, we're going to be talking about a component of that philosophy, the need for dynamic scenario planning. So what happens if we get it wrong?
But I keep telling you, I'm not a pilot. And I keep telling you, you flyboys crack me up.
Hi, I'm Alan. I'm your co-pilot.
As a change of pace, I'm going to let you do most of the work. I think you're ready for it, Alan. And I'll just get us started.
We'll need that to live.
So clearly, that's a capability and a capacity fail. And look, COVID continues to disrupt things and make it difficult to plan. But we really want to ask, how are your leaders thinking about the future? And we really advocate that you need to push them. You need to help them figure out how to align on which possible future should we plan for. And to do that, we need to ask, what is our purpose and what's it going to take to get there? Alicia, you're going to take us through this idea of there's many possible futures.
There are many possible futures, but what this is about is ensuring your organization doesn't make these short-term reactive decisions because it doesn't have that longer-term viewpoint, because those short-term decisions often can destroy your longer-term viability. And we'll chat a bit more about that as we go through. Because the reality is that no one for sure knows what the future is going to look like. Not really. And we are dealing with something with a scale beyond which any of us have ever seen before. But we have had shocks in the past, and we will again in the future, no doubt. But one thing is for sure, this too shall pass. So then the biggest question is not necessarily what's the immediate impact of the shock, but what will its legacy impact be? And that will only emerge over time. You know, thinking about shocks, going back quite a number of years where I once worked, we actually gave it a name. We called it constant shock syndrome. There was September 11, war in Iraq, SARS, bird flu hitting the industry where I worked quite significantly and in what felt like quite rapid succession. We had to understand and model the impact of these shocks on the organisation and our people so that we could have the most appropriate strategies and action plans in place so that we could navigate through and emerge in the most effective way. Then the GFC hit and everything had to be revisited. But we had that line in the sand so we could rapidly iterate and scenario plan. Looking here at these graphics at the GFC, we can see that the impact can be quite different depending on many factors and context. There is no one size fits all for this stuff. You know, looking at the 3 example countries here, they all followed vastly different shapes in terms of shock, progression, and recovery. If we jump to the next slide and we even look in the same country and look at the different impact of different shocks and the rebound rates, you know, there are so many factors that we need to bring together internally and externally for each and every organisation to really be able to understand what could happen for our organisation in the future so that we're not doing those damaging short-term reactive measures. Because if we jump to the next slide, we do know that these shocks impact the workforce. As I said earlier, our organisations are the workforce. Our workforce is the organisation. They're not 2 separate entities. And as Chris said, the workforce is the execution vehicle for realising our value proposition, for executing our purpose. And orgs were already struggling with this, by the way, before COVID, even in the face of the vast change that we're all facing, you know, digitisation, transformation, all of that. We still found that organisations, you know, back to those poll questions you did at the beginning, organisations really rarely had any idea of the workforce that they needed and how that shaped and shifted over their future. So this is really about, again, ensuring that your organisation doesn't make those short-term decisions that can destroy your longer-term viability. Because what will happen is really anyone's guess, but we can't just sit around and passively ride the waves of chaos.
And speaking of that chaos, you know, it continues to be a very noisy time. And in this kind of period of noise, your leaders don't have a shared vision, yet they are making these big decisions, who to keep and which programs to prioritize. And how are they making those decisions? How do they have clarity across the organization on what is most important? We have to learn from Homer and Homer Airlines and not assume that everybody sees the same vision. We've got to do something that takes us a little bit deeper. And we're going to be talking a bit about dynamic scenario planning because it is that mechanism. You know, we're not talking about just workforce numbers, and this is just an HR initiative. This is fundamentally about who we are as an organization, that purpose, and how do we quantify what it's going to take to get there so that we can look at what we have today and plan. Oh, go ahead, Alicia.
Oh, no worries. I was just going to add in, you know, the reality is, you know, we're not trying to predict the future with 100% accuracy here, but if you don't have a coherent plan to emerge effectively, then chances are you won't.
That's right. You often say, all models are wrong, some are useful.
That's right.
And we intend to use dynamic scenario planning because it is very useful. We haven't had the kinds of conversations with organizations when we've gotten to this point in strategic workforce planning where it hasn't been eye-opening. And it's either been something along the lines of CEO has a view and a vision, leadership isn't quite seeing it or aligning to it, and the CEO can use these kinds of sessions to help pick between these different trajectories what they think their strategy is conveying. Equally, we see a lot of organizations where the leadership team gets together and debates each other and actually forms a strategy. So yes, we're solving for workforce ultimately, but really we are defining that purpose. for those of you who kind of sat through our Deconstructing Future of Work before, we think this sits with HR. Those leaders need your help. And dynamic scenario planning is the structured kind of conversation that really helps them align on purpose and helps you figure out, what are we planning for? What line are we trying to reach, so that we know which of our programs are most important and how they need to be geared. But this isn't conceptual, and that's part of its power. We're moving into a sandbox where we can look at different kinds of models safely and figure out, how are we going to connect people to this purpose?
Yeah, and it often becomes a bandwidth issue. We often see leaders saying, well, we've just got these urgent things we need to deal with, and we're whipsawing around dealing with those urgent issues of the day. And there's always a problem of the day. There always will be. But because we haven't stepped back to do the most important thing, which is to create that coherence across our organization, the we'll get to it later often becomes too late. And at its worst, the org may not exist, but in between that spectrum, there can be really damaging measures, and we'll chat a bit more about that later. But what we're trying to do is have a plan for the future, so we can ensure that we have one.
That's right. And just to help us understand a little bit of some of the foundational things around this dynamic scenario planning and models and in the future, I've just got a little ready reckoner here. Some of you who saw our Deconstructing Future of Work with the next group just a few months ago saw us do a longer version simulation of this. And I heavily encourage folks to go back and take a look at that discussion. We didn't want to cover the same territory here, so we have this nice little summary. There's this beautiful blue line called demand, and that's what we need in the future. What are we doing for customers? What are we doing for citizens? What are we on the hook for, and how is that changing over time? That's demand, what we need to do. Nicely the words match what I was saying. Isn't that good, Alicia? And then we have this other idea, supply. What do we have? And we're all really familiar with that. What are the different roles and capabilities and groups we've got now? And we know that people will turn over. We know that we'll have retirement. We'll have different things happening, and that supply is forever dwindling if we do nothing. And the issue becomes, to Alicia's bandwidth, if we get this wrong in the future, we're going to have a significant gap. And a lot of what we do in strategic workforce planning is indeed gap closing, and what actions help de-risk our ability to meet that blue line. And again, that blue line is critical. It's not just profit. It is very much, are we going to transform in time to survive? Are we going to realize and be able to deliver to customer demand to hit our revenue targets, which is usually a big number? Or again, can we deliver on our mandate? Very, very critical. And I think the most important thing that we want to draw for this session around dynamic scenario planning as we go into the next things Alicia is going to show us, that blue line is not set. That blue line, your leaders don't have a shared vision of. Your part of your job is to help call that out and get the leadership team to agree, first of all, on the blue line, so that we can then figure out what we're going to do about it. So let's talk a little bit about the blue line, Alicia.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is, as Chris said, this blue line is about translating the organization context into the activity drivers that create a demand for the workforce, which is simply what size, shape, and skills of workforce do we need and when. And so we usually have, a combination of factors that hit that line. We have our core drivers, the things that we ordinarily do, and being able to really dynamically model with our leaders and say, well, what if this particular volume doubles, triples? What if it drops by X%? What if it goes to 0? And immediately understanding the impact on the organization, i.e. the workforce. We also overlay, though, importantly, our transformation drivers as well. So, accelerating a technology initiative, bringing forward our customer experience initiative through online presence. What if we delay that less important project or entering a new market? What capabilities do we have that need to shape and shift to deal with new ways of working? All of these factors we need to bring together to integrate into this blue line. And then we can see clearly the potential futures. We can compare them. We can see here the impact that different trajectories, different activity drivers have on the workforce required under the 4 scenarios, where we thought we were, a quick bounce back, a slower rebound, or in scenario D, things will never be the same again. But what's really cool is being able to lay these visually out for our leaders, dynamically move these, and you can't see that in this static screenshot, but that's what we're able to do here, and play with all the things that make up these lines and really get that shared view on where the organization's heading and how it's going to get there.
That's
if
right.
we jump to the next,
just looking at this, you can see that if you're facing these different pictures across the entirety of an organization, you're going to make fundamentally different decisions about what you do.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important then to further nuance it with where Alicia is now taking us.
Yeah, because that view that we had on that previous slide was the whole org view, but we can drill down and look that it can be quite different for different segments within the one organization. And as we look at these
airlines, Alicia.
Yeah, we're sticking with our Homer theme here today. Homer Airlines, fly at your own risk. But we can see, we look at these 2 underlying roles, the trajectories under each of these 4 scenarios are quite different. And as Chris said, this impacts what we do as an organization, the decisions we make, the trade-offs we have to consider. This is the build, buy, borrow thing, as Chris said, in that simulation earlier, we've got a declining supply. Things happen with employee movement, whether they're retiring, resigning, being promoted into other roles. Most organizations will just backfill, but you can see with role 1, if we were to do that and we just kept our hiring at that starting point, that we'd be hiring into a declining demand. So we'd be carrying way too many of the workforce. But what we have by having this longer term view that many of you don't, 81%, I think, we have that foresight, that alignment, so that we can ensure, we're not going to make a bunch of the workforce redundant in year 1 if we're going to bounce back in year 2. How do we bring that longer term context to make sure our organization is responding coherently and optimally, not reacting? And that's how we emerge in the most effective way.
That's right. And you can see here on these 2 roles, different kind of skill requirements, different kind of timing to get people up and capable, different kinds of talent pools. So if we just shift a little bit and think about your own organizations, across the different organizations that are represented on this call, there's lots of different trajectories. In fact, I'd say if you even think about your own organization, think about your most critical 2 or 3 roles, they probably have different trajectories sitting across the COVID shock. And there's a lot of complexity then in that, but that's where dynamic scenario planning and SWP comes into play. It's the best way to unravel those varying complexities, help segment the workforce and figure out where do we need to prioritize in order to de-risk our ability to realize the strategy. This
yeah,
sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, looking at this graphic, if we have a role, like just considering the implications, if we have a role that has a trajectory like F or D, we're not necessarily going to hire a bunch of permanent employees because that's, a short-term peak. But if we have a trajectory like E and they're critical, hard to find skills that are really, core for us, we're not going to just fire and rehire either. So as Chris said, there's lead times to productivity and these skill pipelines and supply chains of these particular roles. We need to bring that to bear. So we're, again, making that decision with the best information.
That's right. And making sure, again, we don't make these short-term decisions that we regret within 6 months.
Yeah, where we are now, we'll see a change in how organizations operate for years to come forever. We're all working from home. It's the mandate. Zoom fatigue is real. The bell cannot be unrung here. It's all changing. The who, the what, the where, and even the why of work is all up for grabs. We're being compelled to rethink our operating models and the workforce sitting under it, and really pushing the boundaries to think outside the box in completely new ways. And if we just jump on, as companies prepare to reimagine and ramp up their business models into the new normal, one of the most important imperatives that is recognized is to go deeper on strategic workforce planning. Orgs, as Chris said, need to know what their purpose is and what it's going to take to get there. That for us is the most fundamental question, really, that an organisation can answer. And this is recognising that the to get their part is through the workforce. That's the key execution vehicle for delivering your purpose, the capability and capacity that are going to make us or break us. And it is moving us out of those reactive measures, that I mentioned earlier in the session that we've all lived through time and time again, the blanket workforce percentage reductions, hiring freezes, org restructures that used to happen, every few years, then became yearly, quarterly, monthly, or are now permanent, and everyone's just constantly unsure because there's a fundamental disconnect between the workforce and the organization's kind of purpose and strategy. So these kind of measures, these reactive measures damage not only the people that are immediately impacted, but they also impair the culture, the EVP, the EX, and the CX for years to come, often irreparably. And this is happening because the organization has failed to create a clear plan for the future.
So this next slide, Alicia, is nice and meaty. So maybe just walk us through a little bit about what this says, because I think in particular for the experts that we have on this call who lived and breathed HR, there's a lot of pieces on here that are familiar, but how you brought these together, I think is particularly interesting.
Yeah, so for us, this is really about, again, that future looking view. So you need to have this component in the top right box right first, because if you don't have that longer term basis and understand the workforce size, skills, shape needed, we won't actually then have it in place to be able to deploy on those shorter term bases. I always liken it to, my past life as a finance chartered accountant, to the finance cycles, without having that longer term financial plan and context, the organization risks optimizing just month to month without really knowing where it's heading and how it's going to get there. It's like just setting a budget each month with no line of sight as to how that rolls up to achieve the organization's overall targets, objectives, goals, what it's communicated to its stakeholders, shareholders, etc. And then if you don't have that view, when things don't end up aligned to that budget, you don't know where to fix it because it becomes very siloed and reactive and very unsustainable. So that's really what we're talking about here.
That's right. And so we think you prioritize the top right, strategic at the organization level, before you then break down into those next layers, because this gives you the context for whether they're right or not and where to focus that work.
That's right. Because let's face it, there is uncertainty for us all, personally, professionally, our organizations, our people that we're the custodians of. But having that clarity for the future through scenario planning and proactive forecasting is the way to adapt in a way that is optimal, socially responsible, and sustainable. The costs of not having the bandwidth to do this stuff is, alienating your customers and disengaging employees. It's huge. You need to ensure your organization doesn't make the short-term decisions that destroy your long-term viability. Yes, you may have shifting workforce requirements, but imagine you could let employees know well in advance, help them prepare for transition in a compassionate and honest way, or even better, identify that they actually have 60, 70, 80% of the capability you need in a growing and emerging role, and bring them on the upskilling, reskilling revolution with you. Because let's face it, ensuring our organization's sustainability is probably the biggest thing that we can do for our people.
That's right. And that forms such a critical part of the overall, what are we focusing on? What are we doing? And we use dynamic scenario planning, give us the foundation of what to plan for so that we then know what we should do. And this is just an overarching frame of what is the laundry list of things we could do. SWP helps us define this and other items. It helps us figure out what's the business impact and value of doing those items. And it really helps us embed into leadership. Not all of these need to be completely owned by HR. We need you to help drive. One of the things we talk about a lot is around forecasting demand and getting a good understanding of where some things will help us just span that gap. Some of the things that we've been doing for years that have felt very compliance-based, but are actually critical for the business to succeed. we can use this lens to help get that shared understanding. So we're not just ticking a box, we're actually driving the things we care about because we know they'll have an impact. And finally, at Equate, we've helped a lot of companies through the philosophy and process of strategic workforce planning. Now we have the platform that you really need to help connect your people to your purpose. We would be absolutely delighted to take any questions that you may now have from all of that.
Thank you so much, both. That was just fantastic. And I guess, you know, utilising my expertise as a talent partner in the marketplace, I was really intrigued by your comment around the buy, borrow, build. And obviously a lot of the information and tools that you provided talk about, you know, the strategic workforce planning within an organisation. I guess I'm intrigued to understand how that then interfaces with the external market, because, you know, again, going back to one of your comments, you know, earlier on, in 2020, you know, there was mass redundancies, specifically within the HR discipline of talent acquisition. We're now in 2021, and what's happened is the rehiring of those talent acquisition roles. Now you've got a component of that cohort that are not re-entering into the role. And so, you know, over the last 3 to 4 months, we've seen between a 10 to 15% increase in salaries, and almost you know, almost at 100% capacity utilisation of anyone who is available for a contracting resource. You know, is there the ability through your tools to interface both internal and external market factors?
Absolutely. Alicia, do you want me to start us and you'll?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think when we think about that blue line, there's just to simplify, three major components that figure out how many different blue lines might we think about, and then how do we select the one that we're going to work with. There's what we do today and how we think that may change. There's internal plans for transformation, and there's external market and how that external market is influencing us. And again, there's no crystal ball where we could have said in December 2019, here's the path that we'll be going on. But what we could have looked at was a planned path through a lot of discussion and shared views. And then when that was quite clear that that was about to be disrupted with external, we would have a basis to then understand what does that change mean for us, and to quickly and rapidly have a look. The other piece of that is around this sense of dynamic scenarios, that there's a risk-weighted view around the different things that we're seeing. And so if you're sitting here in 2021 pre-Delta and you look at different potential trajectories, you might have a bit of a view of the speed in which your customer base might come back online. And that might cause you to pre-hire certain roles in case, or to risk mitigate against releasing certain roles because things might happen. What we've had instead is a lot of knee-jerk, quick reactions, demobilizing, remobilizing, pausing. It is an uncertain environment, and strategic workforce planning is looking in terms of quarters and years, not days and months. But it's still at that level where we find people leave themselves with a gap and they put Homer Simpson in the cockpit. Alicia, do you have more to kind of add around how?
Yeah, I think you know, the reality is we can't plan in silos. So the external component is so important in this process. We can't be dictated and driven by external factors. You know, in SWP space, there's a component of environmental scanning, but we need to contextualize it into our organization for it to be meaningful. So we can't just, you know, I think you'll recall from our presentation earlier in the year, you know, we can't just blindly look at future of work data, the robots are coming and panic, or this is happening and panic. We need to contextualize external data into our organization, and that requires that integration through the scenario planning. So absolutely, it's a key component. It hits across the demand, it hits across the supply, and it hits across how we choose to then close that gap through the build, buy, borrow kind of trade-offs. You know, as you saw as well, we also had boost and the impact of technology. the external context is absolutely critical, but where we find it's often missing for organizations is, it's hard to bring so many moving parts together in an Excel spreadsheet. And so then it often kind of becomes a little bit either conceptual and qualitative, or it doesn't happen. And so that's where we're really big proponents of this dynamic scenario modeling as the way to bring together all of those moving parts.
That's right. In fact, in our own approach to these things, in particular, when you get to action planning, gap closing, we look at internal demand forecasts, internal supply forecasts, and external data, including labor availability here and now, but also automation risk and those other things, because that external market is so critical.
Yeah, and it's obviously something that's being, to your point, who would have thought, but it's being severely impacted. And that whole reskilling, upskilling. We hosted another consulting firm who do a lot of work in that space, and there was a data point that on average, most organisations are spending less than $750 per person around reskilling and upskilling. And so that to your point, that longer term view is going to be absolutely critical, but then utilising the information of what your tools can provide, essential to hopefully lift the bar on some of that budget to actually be able to reskill and upskill moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to have that forward-looking view to know where you need to make those reskilling, upskilling changes, because and that's where we find a lot of organizations do struggle, because they're either looking at market data, which is lagging, and so they don't have that future view, and so they roll out one size fits all. Everyone's going to do this digital reskilling program, but it's not necessarily what they need, that part of the workforce need for meeting the organization objectives. So they often fall flat, and as you say, just kind of end up not really hitting the mark. And certainly, we see time and time again, I think it's like 90% of CEOs are, the skilling issue is their biggest concern. And we're seeing that manifest now for many organizations in having, hundreds, if not thousands, of open requisitions in their organizations that they cannot find talent for. And again, that's just, you need to move out of the day-to-day kind of week-to-week tempo and look forward to be able to get that right.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. Please, we've still got a lot of people joining us. Please don't be shy. Use the Q&A chat box. This is your opportunity to have a kind of a personalised session with Alicia and Chris. They're very open to share their knowledge and expertise. So please utilise that chat box, and we can answer any of your specific questions. I will make sure that everybody on the webinar today receives an additional follow-up email with the pre-recorded link to your prior webinar as well, so that people can jump onto that session as well. Well, I think we've got a bunch of shy people today. Or obviously, you've just you've passed over such immense knowledge that they're all walking away SWP experts. Which is
perfect. Well, that's what we want, and we really think getting folks in and doing this stuff and putting in front of people that there are different possible futures. I've never seen, if you get 3 people in a room, a debate about which one actually plays. So I think bringing that kind of lens in and pushing, as you would have heard us call for in the last session, to look forward is quite powerful. It looks like Kirby
actually, here we go. We've got a few questions started now, so there might have been just a little bit of a delay. Have you got access to those, Alicia and Chris, as well?
Yes. Let me bring them up.
So Alicia, the first one, and I can kind of traffic cop these, and you nod at me where you want them. So Kirby asks, wondering about the inclusion of customers within scenario planning. Understand the demand side, having the voice of the executives one, voice of the customer is another. How do we think about customer in terms of driving that demand? Alicia, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Look, I would say that, in the scenario planning process, we don't generally go and involve customers in our business planning discussions, but Absolutely, you know, customer and how that manifests through our drivers is critical. So there's a lot of discovery work that's done ahead of getting to the scenario workshop to make sure that we're capturing things like the voice of customer, changing customer preferences and behaviors, you know, customer journey. All of that is heavily integrated through the demand process. And so that really comes to bear in the scenarios that are then created, and how that then is, I guess, showcased to the executives to then debate the different trajectories. And it's a core part for sure, because if we don't get that right, we're not really achieving what we're setting out to do here.
The biggest moves around an organization forecast are execution of their transformation initiatives and debates about where customer will go, both in terms of volumes, but in terms of behaviors. You know, you look at financial institutions that are thinking about digitization, and they create, for instance, digital channels. Will people be slow to move to those? Are they kind of too hopeful for channel shift or not?
Yeah.
What are their competitors doing? How are they being disrupted? So volumes, but also behaviors are quite critical. And to Joe's kind of earlier question about external factors, we do always include a bit of a component of external research into the industry too, to see what are some of the macro factors that the company should think about around those scenarios.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And thank you very much. That's great. Jackie asked, do you find that scenario planning is best done in strategy with input from P&C as opposed to led by P&C?
Ooh, I'll take this one. So
Okay.
anyone who heard me get on my high horse in the deconstructing future of work knows that I'm a big advocate for P&C to really sponsor this stuff, but not necessarily be the sole owner or drive it alone. I think the answer to that question depends on a few factors, but I do not think that P&C should own it alone. I think P&C is the custodian of people and probably understands some of the broader implications more readily, and sits in a particular spot across most organizations where it's got a particular view that this needs to be solved, and to be able to tell, for instance, a board, we understand what our workforce risks are and we know how we're going to manage them. That being said, strategy is an excellent place for this to be shared with. Strategy is often working with different pockets of the organization to get consensus on where we're going. And they're often doing that and setting the agreed strategy in a vision-based top-down approach, or they're grabbing components from different people's views, but they struggle to bring a coherency around a shared view without bringing dynamic scenarios to the fore. So we often find strategy folk are quite interested and engaged in this. We do have a couple of customers where it's a shared ownership, actually, where strategy is the owner and P&C is part of the project.
But conceptually, I think, you know, SWP works best when it's the integration of finance, HR, and strategy. And that's kind of, you know, the optimal model for this stuff. Needs to be all of those.
Fantastic, thank you. And got another question from Christina, who shares that she works in the planning industry, housing and construction. How do you get the executive to buy into SWP longer term when their reasoning is, but we don't know what opportunities work we're going to win? How do you suggest this exercise being done quarterly or yearly?
This is such a great question, and I'm going to be a hog here and start out on this one too, Alicia.
You should, because you've worked in this industry, so that's, yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
Thank you. You've outed me as an ex Mervac employee. I did work in this industry, but I also think that this issue, there's a couple of things in this question that are really interesting. How do I get executives to buy into SWP, just as a broad question, is a challenge across the board. And one of the fundamental problems or challenges in first kind of getting people to understand this is they're facing these business problems, and they have these problems and questions that SWP answers, but they don't know that SWP is the mechanism for that, because SWP hasn't been around for very long. So most executives haven't seen the outputs done from it, or where it has been done, it's been more at a tactical level, and it hasn't driven these conversations in the same way. So it's emerging more and more that people are understanding that SWP helps answer this forecast around amount. What do we need versus what do we got? This decision around buy, build, borrow, but also this alignment piece, I think, is really emerging for folks. That's going to help us understand and answer some of these longer term issues about where we go. But just specifically, Chrisala, in your question, we don't know what opportunities work we'll get, what projects we'll win, which ones we won't. That almost makes it even more imperative around dynamic scenarios. You can't just kind of take the workforce you've got today and go, we've got this broad strategy that calls for revenue growth, so we're going to assume 10% growth per year across the board, across every role. You've got so many nuance and permutations, and in that organization, you have some roles that are highly contingent on which projects get won, and you have some roles that are somewhat, and then you have other roles that, based on other kind of transformation, other things you're doing, almost are isolated from the number of projects that you have. And bringing that complexity together is one thing. The other thing is going, well, if we win 3 projects, we need to look like this. If we win 10 projects, we need to look like that. And if we win 25, we need to look completely different again. Being able to put a couple of those scenarios in front of people and have them really understand these 3 roles are going to be make or break in that, and we either need 100 engineers, 250, or 275, we need to really drive this conversation. I think it just to simplify, it comes back to Alicia's first 2 questions. Do we know we've got the right workforce today? Yes or no? Do we know exactly what it needs to look like in 3 years? If you can't answer that second question, you can't really say to the board, we're going to execute our strategy.
And if I could just add, and Chrisala, I think we may have worked together back at Qantas back in the day, and familiar. But yeah, one thing nice to, I can't see you, but nice to have you here. I think the other thing I'd be really interested to know is, with your organization, have they ever suffered and felt the pain of having that short-term view? So they've had situations where they've not had enough skills or resources to deliver the stuff that they have won, or had to resort in less than optimal sourcing decisions where they're paying huge premiums because they kind of didn't have that foresight. That's something we usually see manifest in that industry as well.
Fantastic. This could be actually quite a dovetail question, actually. Joanna asked, Chris, Alicia, there appears to be a big leap for organisations that don't do SWP to completing SWP like you both presented today. How do you recommend we start to prepare our organisation for SWP at that level?
Alicia, do you wish to start with that one? I have views, but happy for you to take the lead around org readiness. Where would you like to go?
Yeah, I think org readiness is something we come up time and time again. And I think it's something that I think, it's rare where we see an organization where the planetary alignment has just happened and all the other factors mean that it's perfectly ready. I think it's one of those things that you kind of just have to get started, to be honest, because as soon as you do, one thing that we've really found through our customers in getting started is to deliver a really accelerated SWP up front, engage their leadership early, and that really, that can be done in 4 to 6 weeks, and that creates such a momentum and buy into this whole SWP process. It goes from this kind of thing about what is this, what are you dragging me along to can we be the next cabs off the rank to do this? It's one of those things that I think it just kind of keeps getting, as I said, kicked down the I don't know what this. Kick down the can, whatever.
Kick the can down the road.
Kick down the road.
Tell them about the golden bullet.
The can down the road.
The golden bullet.
The golden bullet.
Tin down the road, I think.
Yeah, you know what I mean, hopefully. But it's like the urgent day-to-day stuff always comes in over the top of that very important longer-term stuff. So just get going. But Chris, you probably have more nuance.
I don't know if I'd often be accused of having lots of nuance, but I'll take it today. I think there is a real piece here around sophistication and SWP maturity, and I think it's daunting. I think a lot of organizations go, I've never really even heard of this thing, demand. And you talk about models, and it's so kind of apart from anything I've done, particularly in my HR function. I'm lost. And we do come across that a lot. I think Alicia's quite right that you've got to start the conversation, but you don't have to have the rocket science version of SWP right off the bat. In fact, I would say there's a lot of nuances around these elements of demand in particular that you can build up towards and to. There's a little bit of, let's just have a broad conversation around trajectories at the beginning. Where do we think broadly this organization is going in its major factors? Let's pick 2 or 3 major factors. Are those things growing or declining? And let's pick 2 or 3 of what we think are our most critical skill sets. And let's start to pair those together and look at 2 or 3 scenarios, to start almost with scenarios. When we work with organizations, as Alicia said, we work very rapidly to build some early scenarios to just help the executive see these major trade-off discussions that are being had, as opposed to getting in the deep granular detail of building perfect demand. If you drag the executive through the kind of challenges of initially building demand, you'll lose them. But if you get them to scenario discussions quickly, and then trade-offs around buy, build, borrow, the next time you come around, they're happy to go a little deeper. And the next time you come around, they're happy to bring members of their executive teams to kind of really engage. So I would start with scenarios.
Or just pick a burning platform issue, some pain point that's being acutely felt, and kind of start there with the approach Chris said. That can be helpful.
Is SWP, and I guess you specifically the work that you do, relative to organisational size at all? Because Athena asked the question, how does your modelling cater for mid-size organisations?
It's an excellent question. I think the principles apply regardless of organization and whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit. In our own organization, we wrestle with our own strategic workforce planning. I think that, what we find, we have organizations that we work with that are sub 1,000, and we have organizations that we've worked with that are north of 100,000. I do think as companies scale and get through the 5,000 plus mark, they start to get more attention to the sheer dollars that are being spent on salaries and wages. And another thing happens, and we've all experienced and know this, the HR function itself builds enough critical mass that it can get its own kind of center of excellence going. And so the reality is there are some aspects of strategic workforce planning that get easier entrance at larger companies. But the fact of the matter is, if you're a 500-person organization and you're targeting $60 million in revenue in the next year, and you get the workforce wrong, you could easily miss that by $5 million, by 10%, by a little less than 10%. And that's a big deal, right? If you're missing out by $5 million, that's customers that haven't been served, they've gone to competitors that you're going to struggle to get back. So I think the business case and the imperative is there for sub 1,000-person companies, but the internal expertise and ability to grab is inherently a little bit harder, and therefore they've got to start with a higher level view to get in here, and I think we need to recognize that.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Final 2 questions, and I think this question actually it's very similar to Fiona's additional question, which was just around additionally, can SWP take into account where in the world future skills will come from, i.e. where we are best to set up hubs for future talent in specific areas of SWP?
Oh, I'm definitely going to defer to Alicia with your wonderful knowledge of our external data sources and how we think about labor availability plus future of work.
Absolutely. I think, this is a huge part of SWPs, that it's not just about capacity, but it's also about capability. So the skills. So for us, this future skills forecasting element is, again, often something that can be overlooked in kind of the old school SWP, and is absolutely something that we need to consider no matter what the organization size is. So to Fiona's point, and hi, Fiona, you know, there really is a need to apply SWP, particularly more so when you do have these kind of niche skills and roles that your organization is dependent on, because they can make or break. It can be one role that can be a showstopper. You know, we worked with a large organization that was standing up this digital function that required on 2 key roles, and they just hadn't done any SWP around this. They hadn't really thought about what those key roles and skills were. That underlined, and they went and launched their business model, and it was due to bring in such a huge amount of revenue, not only for itself, but it's the broader organization, and they just could not get the skills, and they found themselves 6 months down the track and saying to the board, whoops, we've missed all our targets and milestones because we didn't really think about this ahead of time, and we just put an ad out there, and, you know, lo and behold, no one applied. No one wanted to work for us. All the cool digital skills were going to Google or somewhere else. So it's even more critical because they can really make or break your business model. And so SWP really does need to look at that. And as we mentioned earlier, it's not just internally, but you're quite right, bringing in that lens around where these skills are available. How do we need to think outside the box, you know, move beyond sometimes just the traditional employee model and tap into things like the gig economy and freelancers and different locations. And I think the world's become a lot more open since COVID to these alternate modes of sourcing, you know, contingent workforce, whatever. But you need to have that view of demand. You need to know that blue line of what you need and when you need those skills to be able to really do that in the best way.
We've certainly noticed that just within the Next Step business. You know, prior to 2020, so many roles were geographically based, even though they were national businesses. Where now we're getting requirements can be based anywhere. Now, obviously, how long that will last for before we start asking for returning back to the workplace, but, you know, that's another piece.
No, don't come and be back from Austin. It's just about to be football season over here.
Yeah. Final 2 questions, and I'm conscious of time. Tara just asked, can you share any examples where businesses have used SWP to drive diversity and gender representation?
Oh, that's
absolutely.
Do you want to start, Alicia?
Yeah, again, for me, this is, again, the gender one's such an amazing one because it really highlights the importance of needing that forward-looking plan. We've seen so many organizations that set these aspirational targets and then find themselves forever behind the 8 ball in trying to get them actually achieved, or they get there. I
recall 50-50 by 2020, Alicia, when we were first starting this.
Yeah, that was a big one, 50-50 by 2020. That's right. And I think a lot fell short, or they get it in and then they haven't got their soil right, or a leaky bucket, as we like to say. So there's, again, a lot of factors that you need to bring in, and that requires that forward-looking scenario planning, like what's our rate of hire? How many open vacancies have we actually got? How does the movement of our current employees play out? You need to bring together all of those factors to understand how do we kind of, you know, hit the targets that we're suggesting, because a lot of the time we find people also set targets that means they need to hire 150% of a role as females to even get there, because it's just not going to happen with their current profile of movement and trajectory. Plus, we also need to consider the fact that, particularly in certain industries like engineering and so on, everyone else is trying to get the female talent as well. So we need to look externally at, you know, who we're competing with. What are we doing around our whole set of, you know, initiatives across the employee life cycle to ensure we're setting up the right basis to engage with these diverse pools of labor, bring them in, set up the soil so they, you know, can thrive in our environment, and so on. So it's a lot of pieces of the puzzle that need to be really brought to bear to be able to have successful DEI kind of outcomes. And we do find that really can be achieved through the dynamic scenario modeling and the integration of all those elements.
Yeah, it's going to be an absolutely critical piece. I mean, we as an organisation do work nationally with the numbers of the universities, and obviously it's you know, well written about. You know, numbers of graduates or intake is decreasing because of multiple different reasons. You know, when we've been trying to do this big push in STEM, you know, what's going to be the impact in 3 to 5, 10 years because of this short term. I also worked during the GFC period where the large accounting firms got rid of all of their graduate programs, and kind of the 3 years later, everyone was fighting in that war for talent for that period.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, we've seen organizations create their own, you know, programs at the school level, at the university level to stimulate the supply of these diverse people in their fields.
Fantastic. Now, I think I've just accidentally pushed a button and Mark's is... Oh, you've done it. Okay. Fantastic.
I wrote a little text answer there, and I will copy it into the other one.
Perfect.
So that was both spaces, and I'm happy to go into more detail on that one as people are interested. But the fundamental question is, you know, people feel locked into things. This is inherently part of dynamic scenario, is that in 2 or 3 months, if a major thing has changed, we can actually go back and go, what does that mean, very rapidly. And I think we don't see it as a lock. We see it as a moving forecast. But inherently, when you're bringing these shared discussions together, those of us who have worked, and I won't say which of my companies were this, where there's been little fiefdoms and there's been senior executives that can do what they want and don't, yes, I sign up to your strategy, don't worry about how I enact it. SWP does force a little bit of a shared view, and that's a good thing. And so some people will be a little bit reluctant to give up their fiefdom for joining into a shared view and being held to a little bit of a forecast. But it's a movable forecast, so nobody's locked. Where this then informs a 12-month budget, that may well be a lock where people need a business case to change, but they can use SWP to actually create that business case to help sing for their supper of why do I now need to change.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the generous amount of content and time and expertise that you've shared. I was just sitting there reflecting, thinking, you know, it's a little bit like we spoke about, you know, we've been forced into this virtual new ways of working as a result of COVID. Maybe this is the burning platform for SWP to really kind of take the position that it needs for, you know, driving commercial outcomes within a business. And the whole approach around dynamic scenario planning, this is the new norm. You know, probably the next, you know, 3 to 5 years, we will no doubt have these various different macro components that will impact an organisation. So your support and knowledge is just so welcome. Thank you so much once again for joining us. Thank you for dialing in, for Austin, Alicia, for your generous time and presentation. I can see in the chat box that it's really resonated with everybody. Thank you so much for sharing, and hopefully we will look forward to having you return in 2020 if that's possible.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much for everyone who was on the call and joining us today. It was just a delight. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Steph, and thanks, Joe, for hosting us. We really appreciate it.